and students. Students were saying what was on our mind. Everybody and his sister played a guitar, and we were talking to each other. Caffeine was the drug, and I think it was an incredible, incredible time of spontaneity and sharing and communication. They were trying to tell us, however, that there was no war in Vietnam, and a lot of us knew that there was, or we believed that there was. Now, there was a night when I was traveling. Somehow I was stranded in San Francisco airport. And I had a morning flight on the way to Toronto, where I had an engagement in Yorkville at the Purple Onion, which was, kind of a hippie place, a student movement kind of center. And it was the middle of the night, and some soldiers came in, wheeling their buddies on stretchers and wheelchairs. And these guys, I'd never seen anything like that. These guys were all bandaged and shot up. And I got to talking to some of these soldiers, and they knew that there was a war. But what it did for me, it made me question, well, who is responsible for war? Is it these guys? You can't just point your finger at them, although they were there. Or maybe it's generals, maybe it's the generals who make a career of telling these guys what to do. But maybe that doesn't go far enough. Who tells the generals what to do? Who points the generals and the army at somebody else? It's the politicians. But here I am flying on the way to Toronto, and it had to go farther. By the time I got to the Purple Onion, I said, who elects the politicians? It's us, right? His orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war. So it's about individual responsibility. He's 5'2", and he's 6'4". He fights with missiles and with spears. He's all 31 and he's only 17. He's been a soldier for 1,000 years. He's a Catholic, a Hindu, an atheist, a Jain, a Buddhist and a Baptist and a Jew. And he knows he shouldn't kill, and he knows he always will kill you for me, my friend, and me for you. And he's fighting for Canada, he's fighting for France, he's fighting for the USA, and he's fighting for the Russians, and he's fighting for Japan. And he thinks we'll put an end to war this way. And he's fighting for democracy, he's fighting for the Reds. He says it's for the peace of all. He's the one who must decide who's to live and who's to die. And he never sees the writing on the walls. But without him, how would Hitler have condemned him at Dachau? Without him, Caesar would have stood alone. He's the one who gives his body as a weapon to a war. And without him, all this killing can't go on. He's the universal soldier, and he really is to blame. His orders come from far away no more. They come from him and you and me. And brothers, can't you see? This is not the way we put an end to war.
Welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos, and I'm a sociologist who's taught at John Jay College and Yeshiva University here in New York. In a recent review of the critically acclaimed book, Winners Take All, the economist Joseph Stiglitz argues that the corporate titans, the philanthropic plutocrats, and other aspiring so-called change agents who claim to be helping to solve the problems of the world are only reinforcing our lopsided economic reality and making things worse. Rather than push for true structural systemic change and fundamentally questioning the rules of the game, they're hobnobbing on the Aspen Institute, Davos, Global Initiative Conference circuits, trafficking in platitudes and celebrating the new economic world order they've helped create. Despite believing they're working for a better world, they're at most chipping away at the margins, making slight course corrections while the system goes on as it is, uninterrupted. The subtitle of the book says it all: The Elite Charade of Changing the World. Now, in concrete human reality and life chances, their actions and policies have meant an unprecedented increase of deaths, mortality, disabilities, and morbidity among the poor worldwide through what social scientists refer to as structural violence. Structural since they are caused by the social and economic structure of society, and violent since they are inflicted on people by the collective decisions made by people concerning how to share or not share their collective wealth and income. As the psychiatrist James Gilligan puts it, throughout history and around the world, in every society in which wealth and income have been unequally distributed, the poor have suffered deaths and disabilities at higher rates than the wealthy have. Noam Chomsky states it bluntly: as the capacity to coerce decline, it's natural to turn to control of opinion as the basis for authority and domination. The long-standing hostility of the rich to the poor become truly educated is rooted in the need for them to not realize that they are victims of an economic system they need to replace. When they do it, it's a crime. When we, the rich, that is, do it, it's not. As the winners take all control more and more of the narrative, policies and solutions that basically enriches them and creates an ever more dangerous and fearful world, it becomes more and more imperative to use our radical imaginations to develop alternative narratives and visions. How to account for all this and what actually could bring about the necessary changes amounts to the need for a moral and transformative revolution of thinking on violence in which psychiatry can offer invaluable insight and direction. Our guest on the show today, along with her colleague Jim Gilligan, has attempted to bring their model of preventive medicine into psychiatry to a transformative study of structural violence. They attribute the excess deaths and disabilities suffered by those who occupy the bottom rungs of society to the shame, stress, disrespect, and humiliation that result from the negative stigmatization and degradation ceremonies more powerful groups typically wield over those of lower status. A moral revolution in our thinking on violence would entail an end to what is perceived as a never-ending cycle of violence rooted in an unchanging human nature. It's a belief that prophetic radical love, rooted in speaking truth to power, a commitment to love, and letting suffering speak, will allow ourselves to bring out the best in each other, even in the midst of the vicious consequences of maldistribution of wealth and power. As Cornel West puts it so clearly, none of us alone can save the nation or world, but each of us can make a positive difference if we commit ourselves to do so. It's what Buffy St. Marie is singing about to her universal soldier. It's what Reverend William Barber of the Poor People's Campaign means when he asks the question, who will stand in the breach? It's about healing and creating a renewed world where justice is what love looks like in public and where tenderness is what love feels like in private. And we're so excited to once again welcome to the Radical Imagination an internationally renowned psychiatrist and activist who's in the forefront of this movement. As the editor of the New York Times national bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, and over 100 peer-reviewed articles on violence, she's the director of research for the Center for the Study of Violence at Yale University and founded Yale's Violence and Health and Study Group. She heads a project group of the Violence Prevention Alliance for the World Health Organization as well. So welcome, Bandy Lee, once more to the Radical Imagination. And it's great to have you again.
Thank you for having me.
The show and to continue our conversation on structural violence that you've been so involved with for your entire career, right? You've been doing research, you've been active in prisons, you've been in international organizations. What has been your major focus? How have you tried to bring about this transformation in psychiatry? Because most people, right, when we think of a psychiatrist, we one-on-one, years and years of analysis and trying to reach people, transform their inner psychic conflicts, whatever, their depression, so on. And you do that too as well, I'm sure. But you're talking about something else here, structural violence, and how psychiatry, right, institutional psychiatry can begin to grapple with these issues.
Yes, it is. It has been an interesting journey because I started with an interest in violence. I grew up in New York City during a violent era, and I wanted to study it as a psychiatrist. And
you grew up in the Bronx, right?
Mm-hmm.
Rough area?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. The whole city was pretty
at
rough
that time,
back then.
right?
And most people had asked, why would a psychiatrist wish to study violence? We usually study things that we can treat and deal with individuals who can reform themselves. But at the time, I wanted to figure out why it was happening and what goes on in an individual when they decide to become violent. And so I started.
That was telling. What you just said, people didn't think you could treat this. Is that?
That's right.
What do you mean
There
by
was
that?
a time. It hasn't really been that long since we learned that violence is preventable. Violence. I think for a very long time we considered it a part of human nature or
preordained, predestined,
evolutionary
right.
remnant that was that would come about periodically, regardless of what we tried to do. But since the 1980s, in fact, the U.S. Surgeon General at the time, the Surgeon General Everett Koop, was the first to pioneer in the thinking that violence should be treated as a public health problem. And since that time, the scholarship in violence just blossomed, and
that's when this idea of structural violence begins to develop, or a little earlier
well,
than that?
structural violence actually developed separately. It developed with a great Norwegian sociologist named Johan Galtung, as you know. He wrote a seminal paper in 1969 that looked at structural violence as a form of violence. At that time, no one was using, he coined that term because the harm that structures induce through the unequal distribution of social, economic, and political rights would have the effect of diminishing life expectancy and causing deaths and disability and morbidity in ways that far exceed what behavioral violence would do.
Which is more what psychiatry and social work and mental health was dealing with, correct?
Actually, it wasn't dealing with it at the time. Traditionally, it was the criminal justice system
right.
that dealt with violence. In fact, violence was an orphan topic among the fields, in that very few fields and specialties wished to deal with violence.
Criminology,
except
gang
criminology.
delinquency, yeah.
Or it was split up in that historians studied war, psychiatrists studied suicide, criminologists studied criminal violence, and so on. But to look at violence as a human phenomenon and a kind of human disability, impairment, was really started with the public health movement in the 1980s. And then more studies started to come out in the 90s. And then there was a watershed moment in 2002 when the World Health Organization decided to publish its volume on that it called the World Report on Violence and Health. And it's the first volume that collected all the available evidence. The research was done until that time, which at that point wasn't very much, but to put it all together into one volume was very innovative. And in it, it included suicide, homicide, collective violence.
Around the world.
Around the world, and the statistics around the world, and it kept open the interpretation of violence to include violence through power structures, such as in structural violence. And that was really the moment when the scholarship, the area of scholarship took off, looking at violence as a public health problem and a global health problem, and to study it, to study the causes and prevention in ways that that was not done before. Before, it was considered to be a problem that we could only respond to after it happened, but to look at it as something that we could control in the manner of an infectious disease, for example.
So this was data-driven?
Yes.
The rough idea of what sort of data did the World Health Organization find, the 2002 report?
So the 2002 report was remarkable, for example, in that it brought together data from around the world, tried to standardize the data, and it was probably one of the more comprehensive collections of data around the world. And they found that collective violence and warfare, which get a lot of attention and coverage, was only a fraction of the totality of violence. And in fact, suicide turned out to be the most widespread form of violence, more prevalent than all the interpersonal violence, all the collective violence and warfare put together.
Put together. Now that's, I think our readers would, in our audience, would find that astounding. I know the data myself, but that's still, it's incredible.
At that time, it was unknown. It was a surprise to many. And alongside that, because they put different types of violence together under one rubric and looked at them together, we also came to look at structural violence. And structural violence not only as a cause, it's one of the most potent causes of behavioral violence, but it is, as you said, a form of violence in itself, in that it is intentional, in that now that we have all these data, and now that we know that structures cause morbidity and mortality, we are making a conscious decision to...
Because we have control over these.
Yes.
Or we hope we do. Or rationally,
collectively as a society, we are making a decision to institute these structures, to maintain them and to strengthen them. So it is more and more an intentional act.
So the question becomes, who is behind these policies? Or that becomes
the players are often hidden,
and
they may often be long gone by the time the effects are felt. And so it's important to know that there is this collective form of violence that we do all participate in together, in either allowing it or in...
Actively or passively.
Right.
We know about it, but yet we still choose to go along with it. So I was trying to refer to who's going to stand in the breach once you know about this. But we'll get into that.
Yes, and of course, more people, some people have more say in it than others, and some people now, an increasingly smaller group of people, are determining the directions these structures are going. And so some of the little changes you mentioned that the so-called elite are trying to do to try to change the world, improve the world, is really a small drop in the bucket compared to the vastly influential and accelerating acts of structural violence they are condoning and committing.
So you're left with the analysis, the data is there. It doesn't seem like we are rationally responding as we could and should. Does this become what now? A psychiatric issue of mental health, irrational, some sort of pathology within what? Selected individuals or cultures? So now the psychiatrist becomes what now?
Yes,
What
I think
role
psychiatry can be illuminating in that it can show that we're not entirely rational beings, and even if we wish to think of ourselves as such. But it also shows that there is reason behind the irrationality, that it's not, there is a method behind some of the mad things we may do.
That seem mad, but they're right. So people are
It's
at some level
predictable
conscious
and preventable.
predictable, right, and defended. And it's defended partly by creating scapegoats or by what?
I think one of the contributions that the World Health Organization has made in the study of violence is that violence occurs within an ecology. So individuals are not entirely isolated. They are within relationships, within family structures, community structures, and within the whole of society itself. And so that helps bridge some of the gaps in terms of where the causes or means of prevention might fall. Even if the individual commits an act, we can trace it back to all these different levels of causation.
Do we want to hear about these levels? Those of us who pride ourselves in living in a country that we want to think is fair and just and offers opportunities, do we want to hear that message that the data is basically saying, wait a minute now? So are they open to what you're saying?
Yeah, so the benefit of this is that the data are very clear, and we can also pursue research in areas that we don't understand as well. But it's becoming quite clear and consistent, and in fact almost indisputable, that structural violence is the cause of behavioral violence, the most potent driver of behavioral violence, and that we're going to see a lot of violence in society if we increase inequality, for example, economically, socially, politically, health access-wise.
But Bandy, we still are following policies that do the opposite, that are increasing.
Exactly.
So, and we have all kinds of rationales. We have people telling us, well, people aren't measuring up perhaps. Or
so violence rates are a
yeah.
good barometer for a society's collective mental health.
Right.
And so the fact that we have growing rates of suicide, we're at epidemic levels now where suicide levels have been increasing in the U.S. for decades. Now, one of the important contributions that the World Health Organization has made in putting together all the different types of violence is to not isolate the different kinds. In other words, if we just looked at homicide, for example, the overall homicide rates have gone down for the last 25 years and continue to stay down in spite of the rising levels of inequality.
Overall in the country now. But when you begin to differentiate certain areas,
you put homicide together with suicide and count the violent deaths, then we will see that it's been vastly increasing.
So it's joining forces in a sense, or
looking at violence as a
form
whole.
in a different way.
Yes,
coming out in a
that
different
our
way.
violent tendency as a whole is indicative of our level of health. Whether it shows up as homicide or suicide may depend on the circumstances,
Or domestic
may depend
abuse.
on culture, and they often occur at the same time.
Right. Okay.
Often after mass shootings, for example, there's also a suicide, or there's suicide bombers, and we can point to many states where the different types of violence are converging. So it's important. We can learn a lot more by putting the different types of violence together and looking at the state as a whole. For example, there was a very popular book recently that claimed that violence rates were decreasing around the world and that it's becoming less and less of a problem. But the book was only looking at homicide and also extrapolating a lot from European and North American trends for the rest of the world and for the rest of history. But it shows how when we compartmentalize our analysis, a lot can be lost.
So you've worked in prisons as well, right? You've attempted to, and through these efforts, you've understood the nature of homicide and suicide, right? Which, in a sense, sometimes occurs within the same person, or that destructive bent. What about the environment of prison that seems to breed even more of that? And is the larger society then, in a sense, breeding these sorts of people? Or
right.
breeding levels of violence?
You mentioned my dear colleague James
Yes.
Gilligan.
Yes.
He considers prisons to be the concentrated laboratories of what's occurring in the larger society. And Dostoevsky himself said that in order to gauge the level of a civilization, you enter into the prisons. And prisons are very indicative of what we do with violent crime, for example, with violence. Do we treat it as a collective responsibility? Do we try to heal the problem? Or do we meet the violent individual with further violence, which is what we have done through our prison systems, not just in terms of the punishment that it implies, the violence it does to the individuals, splitting up families, fragmenting communities, and also investing in ways that do more damage and taking away from funds that would have helped individuals in the first place. But also it's a mechanism of racism and further discrimination of those who are poor and disadvantaged in society. So it furthers the structural violence that is already occurring.
You use the term punishment. Now, that's not something psychiatry would advocate, right? You want to reform, rehabilitate, make for a healthier individual in society. So we know that, or psychiatry knows what really could make for a better society, a healthier society, a more kindly, more loving society, yet we are so persistent in perpetuating the opposite.
Right, and it
And
comes
we're in
from
wars, what, 8 different wars, 8 different wars at the same time.
Yes.
We have military bases in, was it 160, 170 countries, $1 trillion to war efforts.
yes,
So
and putting more and more into war.
Pretty grim, right? Or
Well, it shows that violence leads to more violence. In fact, it's kind of a vicious circle where violence begets violence, and that's well documented in an individual's lifespan, in communities that have experienced war, for example, have more domestic abuse and child maltreatment.
it's a really important point. So you're saying there's a connection. Cultures that produce violent individuals are also in themselves cultural.
Yes.
And we, of course, right, we tend to, in this country, want to, since we're so individualistically oriented, what's wrong with them rather than what's wrong with the structures that we are creating, and those at the very top are helping to perpetuate.
Right.
Although they seem to be blind to it, or turn a deaf ear, or just simply seek to, avoid that reality.
That's right. You mentioned that this segment will actually end with a spiritual note.
Well, we're getting to that. We're getting to that. and actually, yes, I want.
But I was
okay,
going
go
to
ahead.
mention
Yeah, go ahead.
Father Zosima's words in the Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
Where he says that all are responsible for all, and meaning that when criminality happens, we really don't remedy it unless we find it also in ourselves. We look at our contribution to it, and I don't mean that. I don't mean it in the sense that everyone should feel guilty, but we all play a role in that. Violence is ecologically produced, and every one of us can contribute in a way that mitigates and lessens that violence. Turn the cycle from a perpetual violence onto a different cycle of love, as you mentioned, and that's what we see in the psychological responses, and we are social creatures, and so we do respond very much to what's going on in society, what is condoned and what is rewarded. And if we have a society that not only encourages violence, but rewards it and glorifies it.
Yeah. How does it reward? How does it reward violence? Materially? A lot of people make money, but also
we have
making them feel
subcultures.
better about themselves.
We have subcultures where to be violent is to be a man, and and violence is strength rather than weakness, which is what psychologically it is, and a culture of violence kind of upholds the legitimacy of violence. And then there is actually the greater structural violence that we glorify and reward. People who cheat in business, for example, or corporations that become very large and control the life of thousands of people in ways that are advantageous to them, but not so much for the people. This kind of violence is still not looked upon as something negative in our society. It is rewarded financially.
You're being competitive, you're making it, you're successful.
And it's seen as success.
And it comes out in all kinds of ways,
and not all societies are like that.
Interesting. Yeah, we'll get to that. Are you a tennis fan?
Oh, I haven't watched.
Oh, you didn't watch? Okay, I was wondering.
Unfortunately, I've been too busy.
But you've read a little about, Serena and.
So tell me what happened.
Well, oh God. Well, there's been such a mishmash of analysis there, and as you were talking, look, the greatest female tennis player in the history of the sport.
And then the umpire makes a decision.
Yeah, makes a decision. Talk about cheating. Everybody's doing it. Well, evidently, everybody does do it, and most of the time, almost overwhelmingly, that it's not called. So this time it was called. She denies it. Now I know you and Jim are very, very much involved with issues of understanding violence through what happens to people, how they're shamed, humiliated, and so on. Serena took it as a personal affront to her integrity. I'm not a cheater. Now, she immediately seemed to gravitate toward that. It was something that was going after her honor. Whereas fair-minded people, I don't think really thought that was what was happening, although it's impossible to get inside everybody's heads here. So it was festered in her, and then the violence, if you want to call it that, came out a few minutes later, to the smashing of the tennis racket. Now, the other thing that came out, well, a lot of things came out, but she said that, well, I'm a woman. Men are allowed to do this. Not much happens to it. There's a discrepancy here, there's a double standard. So she brings in the women's issue. She's a mother. Why are you picking on me? I'm trying to be a good role model. She's put on this pedestal. She is the greatest female tennis player in the history of of the world. And so, yeah, we want her. We know she's a ferocious competitor. So all of this gets mixed up in such crazy ways. And now we're seemingly even polarized as a country around this. Is it racist? Is it sexist? How much responsibility should she take? Does she have some emotional issues? Or someone at that level of competitiveness, getting to that level, doesn't that almost mean that you are going to be this way? You've got to be super aggressive to make it to the very top.
Yes, all
Yes,
those
all
things.
those-
All those things are valid contributors, and
I do want to, and we will turn immediately to spiritual issues too. How do we resolve this through issues of love and radical love? And I want to mention, because you've obviously been so intimately involved and active in the analysis of the dangerous case of Donald Trump. It's something beyond, it's an individual we're talking about here, but he represents the larger culture as well, right?
right,
and
because by virtue of being elected to his position as
Exactly.
leader, there had to be some violent tendencies in the population that caused him to be elected, or at least get enough votes to be elected.
To approve
And
it, you know.
yes, but his being in the office of the presidency also escalates the dangers in society and
Right.
stimulates violence, as well as puts us at risk of his
Now,
violence.
again, unless you haven't had a chance, I'm sure you haven't, to be in the White House to actually talk, or not been on the couch here with any psychiatrists that we know of. So I'm sure, right, it's fair to say that he's not thinking this way. He's not thinking that he is in some way perpetuating and fomenting violence. To give it a balance here, perhaps, is it fair to say that he probably thinks this is what's necessary to prevent further violence, to be tough and to...
Certainly he's going to think
So-
that. And
Exactly. So how do we deal with this sort of distorted thinking? And it's rational to a certain extent, right?
well, it's distorted rationality. If you look
Distorted
at
rational. Okay, good way
if you
of
look
putting it.
at mental impairment,
Yeah.
it's almost always distortions of rationality, distortions of legitimate, real responses to reality.
So there's a touch of reality, but it's distorted.
Right.
Is it? Okay.
It's distorted in a way that it does
justify.
damage to the individual as well as others, and that's why it's considered a disease. It's not a state of health that would be life-affirming, and there's a wide variation within the realm of health, and so we can pursue different ideas, pursue different styles, have our own personalities, and all of it be positive and life-affirming as long as it is within the realm of health. But when it starts to enter into patterns of abnormality, that is when I believe that mental health professionals have a duty to point out
warn.
and warn where necessary.
Now, let's bring in radical love. And you are an advocate of spiritual progressivism, transformative, radical love, speaking truth to power, let suffering speak out, and so on.
Well,
How would you describe your own orientation or belief in that in terms of healing the society, coupled with your obvious medical and psychiatric background?
I have to confess, I haven't been as
Uh-oh.
much an activist as you
Okay.
as you've credited me with. In fact, in studying violence, I wish to improve the human condition, and I wish to heal that aspect of humanity. But it was really the day after the 2016 election that people, that calls started flooding in, and emails, and people started calling on me as a violence scholar, as a violence expert.
Right.
To
help us out here to understand what was going on in our political structure.
Right. Or they were essentially fearful
Fearful.
of the violence that would follow this presidency.
So you were responding, you were answering the call.
So that is
That's how that
my
got, yeah.
first foray into the political
Okay.
field. But I still don't consider myself to be political.
Okay.
It's really the same medical criteria that I'm applying to the situation here. But in terms of spirituality, that's something that has been influential just in my personal pursuits, perhaps, and that's why halfway through medical school I decided to go to divinity school and have a context for the work that I did to humanize medicine and to be able to look at things from a much larger perspective.
Because your family, you have that within your family, right? Your father was a physician.
My grandfather.
Grandfather, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so that was part of the tradition that you saw around you, perhaps, the humanized medicine.
The social consciousness was always considered to be a part of medical practice. Well, he was a physician in South Korea after the Civil War there, the Korean War here, when he decided to practice medicine in a way that didn't turn away anyone because they couldn't pay. He lived among the poor. He dressed as his patients did. He had very few luxuries and devoted pretty much all his waking hours to service. And consequently, he had a following and also made his contribution socially.
I hope we have like thousands of American physicians watching this show. I mean, this is something that should strike a chord, but probably doesn't with many.
That's actually been the tradition in medicine for
in this country,
a very long time, to turn medicine more into a technical field where you're just treating the individual is very, very recent.
Yeah, that's what I'm, okay, yeah. That's what I'm saying. We've been, segregating our medical concerns. You
That's
go to
right,
specialists,
becoming more and more subspecialized.
And
the concept
big
of
hospitals, big business, okay, go ahead, yeah.
Even the concept of a wounded healer is more a universal concept, that a physician is someone who has suffered and survived an illness themselves, and they take that knowledge to heal others.
Interesting. You found your colleagues open and receptive to that sort of thinking? Are they?
Well, it's pretty foreign to medical thinking now.
Right.
But it's something I think we ought to return to, and that's to complete the cycle again and to see ourselves as belonging to an ecology, that none of us are perfect and none of us are completely beyond the sickness in society, and that we all do our contribution to try to heal ourselves as well as others.
You're writing about this now, right? More and more, what you've just expressed? You're preparing for another book?
Yes, there will be a book on the wounded healer.
The Wounded Healer.
And then there's another book I'm working on.
Okay.
As you can see, as an academic, I'm often working on several at a time. Another book on creating, well, it's actually more what comes next after this presidency, which has been so damaging in terms of the health and mental health of our society. What do we do to help ourselves heal? And what are the conditions that are necessary for creating a saner society, a healthier society?
You don't have to give away all the secrets. Give it. What are one or two, three things you're thinking about?
Well,
What
it's
can we do
along the.
Can we start the healing before
Oh yes,
this guy gets out? Or
But part of it is, as is the theme of this segment, structural violence. That in fact, the reason why we have become psychologically vulnerable, in fact, there's a state of poor collective mental health that led to this presidency and people being vulnerable and
fearful.
For yes, and for even the pathological modes to be attractive. People like Mr. Trump for his violence and aggressive rhetoric.
They relate to it in some way as
and
he's their champion.
Right,
That they
and
would
it
like to
feels
express,
like
and some do.
feels like relief when they feel powerless themselves, whereas in fact it does them no good.
Again, one of those distortions of reality.
Yes, it's kind of a complicated psychological dynamic that happens, that when you're not doing so well yourself, you are vulnerable and you feel an attraction to pathology, in fact, conditions that are not wholesome or healthy.
The creation of the scapegoat, venting anger at others.
Right.
So that's how we begin, first understanding that that's the dynamics. And that we need to look at this in a public health way. So we need to have another
to see that
leader like Coop again.
The anger, the desperation have legitimate reasons, causes that have brought these feelings about. The responses may be unhealthy or misdirected, but the feelings have come about because of conditions in society. And a lot of it has to do with the escalating structural violence that you have mentioned, the socioeconomic disparity, inequality, denial of access to health care, denial of access to education, to a livable wage. The UN recently put out a report saying that middle and poor income Americans are doing terribly under this administration, and actually have been doing poorly, but are doing far worse under this administration. So they're actually worsening conditions for themselves by who they elect to have as their leaders and what kind of policies they allow to be supported.
But what you were saying before, listening to people, taking them seriously, listening to them and not just shunt them away, these are deplorables.
Right,
and I think
right.
that's very, very important to listen
I think
and give
we-
respect to people. Not necessarily respect everything they're saying,
Right.
but
yes. A lot of their misconceptions have been also generated because not only have they been deprived of
right.
A good education, they've been deprived of information and facts, a correct representation of what is truly happening.
Sounds like a very powerful beginning plan of action, and I know we're just a couple days from Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, where one of the things, of course, that's stressed so much is love of the other, love of the stranger, for you were a stranger in a strange land. So I think that's a very good way of perhaps ending this show, and the need to appreciate and respect others. And realize that that is the beginning of our own mental health and our own self-esteem and healing of others who perhaps have been helped and hurt by this very system that we want to make better.
Yes, and as my dear colleague and mentor James Gilligan has often said, laws are only necessary where love is lacking. So where there is love, there will be social justice. And we will create the conditions that are necessary for our own healing.
We will. And Bandy, thank you so very, very much for being on the show. We've got to wrap it up. It's been great to have you on once more. This is Jim Vredos here on The Radical Imagination. want to thank our guests so much again, Bandy Lee. We'll see you next week on the Radical Imagination. Take care.
Heard there was a secret chord David played and it pleased the Lord. You don't really care for music, do you? Well, it goes like this: a fourth, a fifth, minor, fourth, major lift, a baffled king composing. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. Well, your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof, her beauty and the moonlight overthrew ya. She tied you to her kitchen chair, she broke your throne and cut your hair. From your lips she drew hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Baby, I've been here before, I've seen this room, I've walked this floor. I used to live alone before I knew ya. Then I saw your flag on the marble arch. Our love is not a victory march. It's cold and broken. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. Maybe there's a God above, but all I've ever learned from love was how to shoot somebody who outdrew ya. Well, it's not a cry that you hear at night. It's not someone who's seen the light. It's cold and it's broken. Hallelujah, 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 hallelujah. 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 Hallelujah.